A note before we begin. Most of what survives about Diogenes comes from later ancient anecdotal traditions, especially Diogenes Laertius, writing centuries after Diogenes lived, where the historical record is uncertain. We will say so. What follows is the most honest account the tradition allows. Picture a large clay jar on a street corner in Athens. Not a home, not a shelter built for a human being, a storage vessel, the kind used for grain or olive oil, tipped on its side in the open marketplace. The smell of fish and bread and sun-warmed stone moves through the air round it. Dogs pick through scraps nearby. Merchants argue in the distance. The noise of the city is everywhere, and constant and entirely indifferent to the man inside the jar. He owns almost nothing. He wants almost nothing. When a child passes by and drinks water from cupped hands, the man watches quietly, then reaches into his few possessions and throws away the one wooden cup he kept. The child just showed him he did not need it. When Alexander the Great, the most powerful ruler in the known world at that moment, rides across the city specifically to meet him and asks what gift he can offer, the man squints up from the ground and says one sentence: "Step out of my sunlight." Alexander turns to his companions and says, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." The man in the jar does not return the compliment. His name is Diogenes of Sinope. He called himself a citizen of the world at a time when that phrase had no meaning to anyone. He is the reason philosophy learned to laugh at itself. He is the missing connection between Socrates and many later Stoics who told themselves that what they cannot control does not matter, and he lived in a jar. Settle in, let the noise of the day fade. We begin. Chapter 1. The Exile, a Counterfeiter's Son. The city of Sinope sat on a narrow peninsula, curling into the Black Sea like a finger testing the water. It was a prosperous Greek colony on the southern shore of that sea, in what is now the northern coast of modern Turkey. The smell of salt and timber and fish was in every street. Ships came and went with cargo from across the known world. The city had a mint. It produced silver coins that circulated across the region, carrying with them the authority and the reputation of a place that knew how to handle money. Into this city, at some point in the latter half of the 5th century BC, though the ancient sources give us no precise date, and scholars continue to debate even the approximate range, a boy was born who would spend his adult life arguing that money was one of the least interesting things a human being could concern themselves with. His name was Diogenes. His father, Athenian, was connected to the mint, and at some point the mint became the centre of a scandal that would push the young man out of his home city and, in the particular way that exile sometimes works, directly toward the life he was meant to live. The crime was counterfeiting. The Greek word the ancient sources use is paracharatin, to deface or falsify the currency, to stamp something with a mark it does not deserve. Whether Hicesias was the primary figure in the scheme, whether Diogenes was involved directly alongside his father, whether he was implicated by association or by action, the sources preserve different versions, and we cannot say with certainty which is closest to what actually happened. What the tradition agrees on is the outcome. Diogenes left Sinope. He left under a cloud of disgrace that had attached itself to his name before he had done anything philosophical to deserve a name at all. He went to Athens. Now here is the question that separates a careful reading of this origin story from a careless one. Every ancient source that tells the counterfeiting story also connects it, explicitly or implicitly, to what Diogenes later became. Diogenes Laertius records a story in which Diogenes asked the oracle at Delphi what he should do with his life. The oracle told him to deface the currency. Diogenes initially understood this as permission to continue what had already been done in Sinope. Later, the tradition says, he came to understand the instruction differently. The oracle was not talking about coins. It was telling him to deface the currency of values, to take the accepted coinage of Athenian civilization, the worth placed on wealth and reputation and political power and comfort, and stamp it with a different mark, to show people that what they were treating as gold was, on examination, something considerably cheaper. We should be honest that this interpretive story has the quality of a meaning applied in retrospect. The ancient world loved a founding myth. Whether the oracle visit happened exactly as described, whether the words were as the tradition preserved them, we cannot verify. What we can say is that the ancient world found this story too useful to let go of, and that its usefulness tells us something true about how people understood Diogenes, even if the details cannot all be confirmed. He arrived in Athens as a young man. The city he entered was not a confident place. The Peloponnesian War had ended in 404 BC with Athens in defeat. Its long walls torn down to the sound of flutes. Its empire gone. The democracy had been briefly overthrown by the 30 tyrants. A brutal oligarchic regime that had executed 1,500 citizens in 8 months. Socrates had been tried and executed in 399 BC for impiety and corrupting the youth, an event that had sent tremors through the intellectual world of the city that had not yet stopped moving. Philosophy in Athens, in the years Diogenes arrived, was not a comfortable occupation. It was an activity that had recently gotten the most famous practitioner of the previous generation killed by a democratic jury. The schools and the thinkers and the students who gathered around them were still working out what that death meant, what philosophy was for, what it required of the person who practiced it. Diogenes walked into this city with no money, no connections, and an exile's particular relationship with social respectability. He had none, and he had already decided he did not want any. He slept where he could. He ate what he was given or what he found. The tradition records him as having taken up residence in or near the Metroion, the temple of the Mother of the Gods in the Agora, where a large pithos, a storage jar of the kind used for grain or oil, became associated with him. The pithos is the famous barrel of popular memory, though it was not a wooden barrel in the northern European sense. It was a Greek ceramic storage vessel, large enough for a man to sleep in, open at one end. He chose it deliberately. Athens watched. A man living in a jar in the Agora was not invisible. He was not a curiosity to be noted and forgotten. He was a statement, made in the most public possible place, to the most sophisticated audience the Greek world had assembled. The statement was still forming, still finding its shape. What it needed, to become what it would become, was a framework. What it needed was a teacher, or more precisely, it needed a teacher who did not want to teach him. That is where we are going next. The man from Sinope had arrived. Athens had no idea what had just walked in. Chapter 2. Athens receives a man it wasn't ready for. Picture the gymnasium, called the Cynosarges, on a dry afternoon in late summer. It stood on the outskirts of Athens, past the city walls, near the banks of the Ilissos River, not the most prestigious address in the city. The great gymnasia, where the wealthy trained, attracted a different clientele. The shade there came from plane trees rather than olive groves. The dust rose differently from the training ground, coarser, less managed. The sound of the city reached it only faintly, muffled by distance and the dry Attic air. Here taught Antisthenes. He was old by the time Diogenes found him. He had been one of those who followed Socrates and engaged with his method, sitting with the old philosopher through the decades of questioning and watching in 399 BC, as the city that Socrates had spent his life trying to improve put him to death. Antisthenes had carried that death with him ever since. What he concluded from it was something that none of Socrates' other famous students had concluded. Not Plato, who went on to build the academy and write the dialogues and construct the most elaborate philosophical system the ancient world had yet produced. Not Xenophon, who wrote histories and memoirs and made Socrates into something closer to a practical sage. Antisthenes looked at what Athens had done to Socrates and concluded that the problem was attachment. Attachment to reputation. Attachment to comfort. Attachment to the good opinion of a democratic city that could turn on you the moment the political winds shifted. His answer was to want less, to need less, to make himself, through deliberate practice, into a person whose well-being could not be taken away by a jury vote or a hemlock cup. He did not want students in the conventional sense. He did not want people who came to acquire a credential or a social connection. He wanted, if he wanted anything at all, people who understood that what he was offering was not comfortable. When Diogenes came to him, Antisthenes told him to go away. The account preserved by Diogenes Laertius carries the quality of a story shaped by centuries of retelling, polished into the form that best illustrated its meaning. Antisthenes raised his staff to strike the young man from Sinope. Diogenes held out his head and told Antisthenes to strike if he wished, because no wood hard enough existed to make him leave as long as Antisthenes kept speaking. Antisthenes put down the staff. He accepted Diogenes as a student. We should be honest, as we will be throughout this account, about the historical texture of this moment. Diogenes Laertius is writing in the 3rd century AD, roughly 600 years after the events he describes. The encounter with Antisthenes has the quality of a founding myth. Stories with that quality tend to sharpen over centuries of retelling. The symbolism becomes more perfect. The details arrange themselves into the shape of the meaning rather than the shape of the afternoon. What the tradition consistently believed is that Diogenes stood in the lineage that ran from Socrates through Antisthenes. This connection was, in the understanding of the people who preserved these accounts, the essential explanation for what Diogenes became. Antisthenes had argued that virtue was the only good, that the things Athens valued, wealth, status, physical pleasure, political influence, were not goods at all, but distractions from the only thing that mattered, which was the quality of the soul doing the choosing. He argued this. But he still lived in a house. He still wore clothes appropriate to a person of his position. He occupied a recognizable place in Athenian social life, even as he criticized the values that life was organized around. Diogenes heard the argument and took it to its conclusion. If virtue is the only good and everything else is indifferent, then everything else should be treated as indifferent, not just argued to be indifferent, lived as indifferent, every day, in public, without apology and without the slight softening of the principle that comes from wanting people to think well of you. This is what the teacher had not quite done, and this is what the student was about to do with a completeness that would make Antisthenes look, in retrospect, like a man who had drawn a map to a destination he never fully reached himself. The years Diogenes spent with Antisthenes are not well documented in the surviving tradition. What we have is a before and an after. Before Antisthenes, Diogenes is a young exile, finding his footing in a city that has no particular reason to pay attention to him. After Antisthenes, he is a man with a framework sharp enough to cut through every social convention Athens placed in front of him. The framework had a name, though Diogenes may not have used it in the formal sense that later generations applied. It would come to be called Cynicism, from the Greek word for dog, and to understand why that name matters, and why Diogenes not only accepted it, but leaned into it with the relish of a man who has decided that the insult is actually a compliment, we need to stop and look carefully at what this philosophy actually was, because it is not what most people think it is, and getting it wrong means misunderstanding everything that comes next. The teacher had accepted the student. The student was about to become something the teacher had not anticipated. Chapter 3. What is a cynic? Actually, forget, for a moment, what the word means today. Set down the modern meaning entirely. The idea of someone who believes people are motivated only by self-interest. Someone who meets expressions of generosity with a slight smile and the private certainty that there is always an angle. That meaning is useful in its own context. It is almost entirely unrelated to what cynicism meant in 4th century BC Athens. Put it down, because what you are about to hear is something considerably more interesting, and the modern meaning will get in the way of it if you let it stay. The name comes from the Greek word kainikos, dog-like. In the agora of Athens, on any given morning, the dogs were everywhere, moving through the market stalls, sleeping in patches of shade against the temple walls, eating what they found, going where they went, paying no attention to the social hierarchies that governed every human interaction in the same space. A merchant of high standing and a slave carrying goods walked past the same dog, and the dog treated them identically. The dog did not dress itself for company, did not adjust its behaviour because of what the neighbours might think, did not defer to power or perform respect for wealth. It focused, with complete consistency, on what it actually needed: food, water, warmth when cold, shade when hot. Nothing performed, nothing extra, nothing unnecessary. 2. The Cynics. This was not an image of degradation. It was an image of freedom. Now stop for a moment and put yourself in the agora, not as a philosopher, as an ordinary Athenian with a morning's worth of business to conduct. The fishmonger is already performing. He is presenting his catch as fresher than it is, speaking in the practised voice of a man who has calculated the distance between what he has and what he can claim to have. The politician passing through is performing. He has arranged his face into the expression of a man who cares about the people around him in the specific way that useful votes require. Even the wealthy citizen dressed in expensive fabric is performing, announcing something to everyone, He passes about his position and his worth, and what kind of person he is. Every single human being in that space is managing something. The dog in the shade is managing nothing. This is what the Cynics were pointing at. Not that wealth was evil, or that comfort was sinful, or that the city was beyond hope, but that the gap between what people were working so hard to acquire and protect and what actually produced a good life, when examined carefully, was very wide indeed, and nobody was examining it. They were too busy maintaining it. The ancient Cynics were not pessimists about human nature. They were telling you something almost opposite, that human beings were capable of genuine virtue, genuine freedom, genuine happiness, and that the reason most people did not achieve these things was not that human nature was corrupt, but that human civilization had buried the path to them under an enormous pile of unnecessary customs, social obligation, false values, and inherited assumptions that nobody had bothered to examine. They were asking a question that sounds simple and is not. What do you actually need? Not what has your culture taught you to want. Not what will make people respect you or envy you or invite you to the right gatherings. What does a human body and a human mind actually require in order to function well and live well? Food, water, shelter adequate to survive the elements, the exercise of reason, genuine friendship, meaning relationships based on virtue rather than mutual usefulness, and according to the Cynics, essentially nothing else. Everything beyond this was not a good. It was a complication, a source of anxiety, a thing that could be taken away, and therefore a vulnerability, a point at which the external world could reach in and damage you. Now, here is the editorial point that separates a serious engagement with cynicism from a casual one. The Cynics were proposing this not in a lecture hall or a quiet garden, but in Athens, in the 4th century BC, to people who had watched the most sophisticated democracy in the ancient world vote to execute Socrates for asking questions, to people who had watched the Athenian assembly vote for the Sicilian expedition with wild enthusiasm and then watched that expedition return in fragments, the fleet destroyed, the soldiers dead or enslaved in the stone quarries of Syracuse. To those people, the Cynic argument was not abstract. It was a diagnosis of something they had witnessed with their own eyes. The city that organized itself around wealth and power and reputation had produced these results. What if the organizing principle was wrong? What if the things the city was working so hard to acquire and protect were not actually the things that produced a good life? What if the cup could be thrown away? Plato, working a few miles away in the academy, was asking the same questions through the method of systematic philosophical argument. He was building upward, toward the ideal city, toward the philosopher king, toward the eternal forms that gave imperfect physical things their borrowed reality. Diogenes was asking the same questions by a different method entirely. He was building downward, stripping away, finding the minimum, and then living at the minimum, publicly, in the marketplace, where anyone could observe the results and draw their own conclusions. The Stoics, who came after and who owe more to this tradition than they always acknowledged, would take the Cynic insight and build a system around it. They would make it compatible with public life, with property, with the social roles of senators and emperors. They would write it down in careful prose and teach it in organized schools. But the Cynics refused this compatibility. The philosophy had to be lived at full intensity, or it was not really being lived at all. You could not believe that reputation was indifferent, and then spend your afternoons managing what people thought of you. You could not believe that social convention was arbitrary, and then follow it anyway, because following it was easier. The consistency had to be complete, or it was not consistency. This is what made Diogenes, in particular, impossible to dismiss. He was not arguing that wealth was unimportant. He was living without it and appearing, by every observable measure, to be perfectly fine. He was not arguing that social convention was arbitrary. He was ignoring it in the most public possible place and inviting anyone who disagreed to explain, specifically and carefully, why the convention existed and what it was actually for. The dog in the shade knew what it needed. The question was whether the humans moving through the same space did. The philosophy had a name. What it needed was a body willing to prove it. And in the agora, beside the wall of the Metroion, the proof was already underway. Chapter 4. The tub, the cloak, the wooden cup, in the agora of Athens, in the middle of the 4th century BC. The morning begins with noise. The fishmongers arrive first, before the light has fully settled over the Acropolis. Then the bread sellers, the olive oil merchants, the potters with their wares arranged on the ground. By mid-morning the whole marketplace is alive with the particular noise of commerce and argument, and the low, continuous sound of a city that has decided it has things to do and intends to do them loudly. Against the wall of the Metroion, slightly set back from the main flow of foot traffic, but not so far back as to be invisible, sits a large ceramic jar, tipped on its side, open at one end. A single rough cloak hangs over the opening in the early morning, pushed aside as the day warms. Inside, a man is already awake. He has been awake since before the fishmongers arrived. There is no particular barrier between his sleep and the waking world. No walls to hold the darkness in. No door to keep the morning out. The cold comes in. The light comes in. The smell of the city comes in. The boundary between inside and outside, for a man in a yard, is entirely permeable. He finds this acceptable. This is where the philosophy begins. Not in an argument, not in a lecture, in the daily fact of waking up in a ceramic jar in the marketplace and finding it acceptable. The pithos was not a wooden barrel in the northern European sense. It was a large Greek ceramic storage vessel designed for grain or olive oil or wine, typically large enough for a man to curl inside, not large enough to stand, not large enough to move with any freedom, large enough, precisely, for what Diogenes needed. He chose it deliberately. The tradition is consistent on this point, even if the precise circumstances of how he came to occupy it are not fully documented. And the choice was not about poverty in the way that modern readers tend to interpret it. It was not a political statement about wealth inequality. It was not an aesthetic choice about the beauty of simplicity. It was an experiment, a sustained, public, long-term experiment on the question of what a human life actually requires, when you strip away everything that convention has told you it requires, and look at what remains. A human being can live here, not survive here, live here, think here, receive visitors here, ask questions that make powerful men uncomfortable here. If that is true, then everything between this jar and the grandest house in Athens is not necessity. It is preference, and preference once you see it clearly as preference rather than need, loses most of its power over you. He wore a single rough cloak, the tribon, a coarse doubled garment that served as clothing during the day and a blanket at night. He wore it in all seasons. When asked about the cold of an Athenian winter, he is recorded in the tradition as responding that if he were properly affected by it, he would feel it more. This is a Cynic answer, which means it operates on two levels simultaneously. On the surface, it is a claim about his own physical conditioning. Underneath it is a philosophical point about the relationship between expectation and experience. If you expect warmth as a baseline condition of existence, cold is painful. If you have stopped expecting warmth, the cold is simply weather. The suffering we build around discomfort, the dread and the resistance, and the story we tell about how unfair it is, often exceeds the discomfort itself. He had access to his own body and a willingness to use it as an experimental subject. That was enough. The wooden cup story is the one that stays with most people who encounter the tradition. He carried, among his few possessions, a wooden cup. One day, walking through the city, he stopped to watch a child drink water from a stream by cupping both hands together and lifting them to the mouth. He watched for a moment, then he reached into his bag, took out the cup, and threw it away. He already owned more than he needed. The child had just shown him what the minimum actually was. This story appears in multiple ancient sources with slight variations, and it has the quality of a teaching story whose truth lives in what it illustrates, rather than necessarily in the precise details of a specific afternoon. But what it illustrates is the core Cynic method in its most elegant form. Take any possession. Find the actual function it serves. Ask whether that function can be served more simply. If yes, the more complex version is not a good. It is weight. It is something you carry that slows you down without adding anything real to the journey. The cup was weight. The child's hands were enough. The cup went away. Now, extend this method across an entire life. He was not performing poverty. He was not performing philosophy for an Athenian audience, though it was certainly visible and certainly noted. He was running a sustained experiment on what a human life requires. In public, in the agora, where anyone who wanted to could observe the data and draw their own conclusions. The results, as far as the tradition can tell us, were consistent. He was not miserable. He was not depleted. He was not, by any account that survives, a man who gave the impression of suffering through his choices. He was, by the account of the many people who came to speak with him, including some of the most powerful and accomplished figures in the Greek world, a man who gave the impression of being genuinely free in a way that his visitors, for all their wealth and influence, were not. The question he was silently asking everyone who walked past his jar was not an insult. It was a genuine inquiry. What are you carrying that you think you need? And when did you last actually check? He had thrown the cup away. The philosophy was now fully embodied. And across the city, in a quiet grove of olive trees, a very different philosopher was watching. Chapter 5. Plato's Shadow and Diogenes' Retort. A mile northwest of the agora, past the Dipylon Gate, along a road lined with the grave markers of Athenians who had died in the city's many wars. A grove of olive trees offered shade from the Attic sun. The grove was named after a legendary hero called Academus. The air there was quieter than in the city. The dust settled differently. The sound of the marketplace did not reach it. This was where Plato built his school, sometime around 387 BC. The contrast with the agora, where Diogenes lived, was not accidental. Plato had chosen distance from the noise. Diogenes had chosen the centre of it. They were, by any reasonable measure, the two most significant philosophers working in Athens in the middle of the 4th century BC, both responding to the same event, the trial and execution of Socrates in 399 BC, the single most consequential moment in the history of ancient philosophy. Both had organized their intellectual lives around the question that Socrates' death had made unavoidable. What does it mean to live well? What is virtue, really? And what should philosophy actually do in the world? Plato and Diogenes arrived at answers so completely opposite that the distance between them is not just a philosophical disagreement. It is a disagreement about what philosophy is for, what the philosopher's life should look like, and whether the search for wisdom should produce a system or a practice, a school or a jar. Plato's academy began with mathematics, because Plato believed that mathematical truth was the training ground for the philosophical mind, the place where reason first learned to grasp something eternal and unchanging beneath the flux of the visible world. From mathematics, the student moved to dialectic, to the rigorous examination of ideas through argument and counter-argument. The goal was to understand the forms, the eternal, perfect realities that Plato believed were more real than anything the eye could see. It was a serious, sustained, institutionalized attempt to make wisdom reproducible. Diogenes, as far as the tradition suggests, found this somewhat amusing. The specific encounters between Plato and Diogenes recorded in the ancient sources carry the polished quality of stories that generations of readers found too useful to forget. We cannot verify their precise details, but they illuminate a philosophical truth worth examining carefully, even when the exact historical circumstances are uncertain. The most famous is the plucked chicken, Plato, working on his definition of the human being, arrived at what he considered a useful formulation. A human being was a featherless biped, 2 legs, no feathers. It distinguished humans from other animals in a way that was at least technically accurate. Diogenes heard this definition. He obtained a chicken. He plucked it. He removed every feather from the bird until it was bare-skinned and technically, by Plato's definition, a featherless biped. He walked into the academy, held up the plucked chicken, and announced, "Behold, Plato's man." Plato added to his definition, "A human being," he revised, "was a featherless biped with broad, flat nails." The story is funny. It was probably meant to be funny, but the philosophical point underneath the humour is sharp enough to draw blood. Diogenes was not mocking Plato personally. He was demonstrating a problem with the entire approach. If your definition of a human being can be satisfied by a plucked chicken, your definition has missed something essential. And if your method for understanding reality is to construct abstract definitions and test them against logic and argument, you will keep missing things that only become visible when you put the definition into contact with the actual, inconvenient, unpredictable physical world. Plato's forms existed in a perfect realm, accessible only to reason. Diogenes' philosophy existed in the marketplace, in the body, in the daily practice of someone choosing, concretely and visibly. How to live. The chicken was not a joke. It was a methodology. Plato reportedly called Diogenes a Socrates gone mad. This is one of the most quoted lines in the entire tradition, and it is worth pressing on, because it is not simply an insult. Socrates had asked the questions. He had walked through Athens asking people to examine their lives and their assumptions, and the values they had inherited without thinking. He had argued that the unexamined life was not worth living. Diogenes took Socrates' questions and answered them, completely, without the slight distance that allowed Socrates to still function as a recognizable member of Athenian society, to have a wife and children and a place in the community, even as he questioned everything the community stood for. Socrates gone mad, then, might mean Socrates taken seriously. Socrates, with the conclusions, actually followed to their end, rather than left open as permanent questions that make for excellent dialogues but do not require the philosopher to actually live differently. This is what the philosophical tradition has never quite resolved about the relationship between Plato and Diogenes. They were not answering different questions. They were answering the same question and arriving at answers that were almost perfectly inverted. Plato said upward, toward the forms, toward the perfect city, toward the philosopher king who had ascended from the cave of ordinary perception into the light of genuine understanding. Diogenes said downward, toward the minimum, toward the baseline of genuine human need, beneath all the accumulated weight of social construction. And between them, in Athens, in the 4th century BC, with the academy in its quiet grove, and the jar propped against the Metroion in the marketplace dust, the argument was not abstract. It was two men, in the same city, in the same century, living out two completely different answers to the same question. In public, where anyone could observe both and make up their own mind, Plato built an institution. The academy outlasted him by nearly 900 years. His dialogues became the foundation of the Western philosophical tradition, as it was transmitted through Christianity and the medieval world and the Renaissance, and into the modern university. Diogenes wrote nothing, left no institution, left no organized school, and yet here we are, more than 2,000 years later, still talking about the man in the jar and the plucked chicken. There is something in that persistence worth sitting with quietly for a moment before we go on. Two philosophers, one city, one jar and one academy, and between them, a question that neither of them fully answered, but both of them spent their lives illuminating. Chapter 6. The Lantern in Daylight. It is mid-morning in the Agora of Athens. The sun has cleared the Acropolis, and the light has gone from the soft gold of early morning into something harder and more direct. Shadows have shrunk to small dark patches beneath the columns of the Stoa. The marketplace is at full noise. Merchants and buyers and idlers and politicians all moving through the same dust. The same smell of fish and olive oil and sun-warmed stone, all conducting the business of an ordinary Athenian morning. Through this crowd moves a man carrying a lit lamp, not a torch, not something with any conceivable practical purpose in full Mediterranean daylight. A small oil lamp, its flame almost invisible against the brightness, held out in front of him with the deliberateness of someone who knows exactly what he is doing. When people stop him and ask what he is doing, his answer is brief. He is looking for an honest man. Stay in this image for a moment before we move past it. because it is not only a joke, and treating it as only a joke is the fastest way to miss what it is actually doing. Athens, in the 4th century BC, was a city saturated with arguments. The sophists sold arguments by the hour. Plato constructed arguments of breathtaking sophistication in the academy. The assembly ran on arguments. The law courts ran on arguments. Arguments were the currency of Athenian public life. And like all currencies that circulate too freely, they had begun to lose their purchasing power. You could argue anything in Athens. The sophists had demonstrated this conclusively. You could argue that justice was whatever the strong imposed on the weak. You could argue the opposite with equal technical facility. You could argue for any position and against any position, and the arguing itself had become a kind of performance, a demonstration of skill rather than a search for truth. If everything can be argued, nothing can be settled. Diogenes' response to this was not to construct a better argument. It was to stop arguing and start demonstrating. The lamp in full daylight is doing several things simultaneously. It is saying that the thing being searched for, honesty, should be visible in plain daylight and is not. The daylight is already there. It should be enough, and yet the lamp is necessary, which means the honesty is not there in the form that daylight should be able to reveal. It is saying this in the middle of the marketplace, not in an academy, not in a private home, in the place where the city conducts its daily business, where the performances of social life are most concentrated and most visible, where merchants present their goods as better than they are, and politicians present their intentions as purer than they are, and ordinary citizens navigate the gap between what they actually think and what it is safe to say they think. The lamp is in that space, looking, not finding, and everyone who sees it knows, without needing it explained, that the statement is not entirely wrong. What followed from this basic method, the method of enacting an argument rather than stating it, was a series of actions that the ancient tradition records and that modern readers tend to encounter as a list of provocations. Eating in the marketplace, performing private acts in public, begging from statues, carrying the lamp through the agora. Each of these is typically presented as evidence of eccentricity or contempt for convention or a desire to shock. This framing misses what the actions were actually doing. Each one was a specific physical argument about a specific philosophical point. Each one identified a convention, held it up to the light, the lamp was always burning, and asked the question that the convention most needed to be asked. What is this for? He ate in the marketplace, a violation of Athenian social convention. Eating was a private activity, associated with the household, with the proper domestic sphere. When criticized, Diogenes responded that if he was hungry in the marketplace, it was in the marketplace that he should eat. The hunger was real. The convention about where to address it was arbitrary, and arbitrary conventions, once identified as arbitrary, have no claim on a person who has decided to live by nature rather than by custom. The Greek philosophical term for this distinction is the distinction between physis and nomos, nature and convention. Physis is what exists independently of human decision. The actual requirements of a body, the actual facts of the world. Nomos is what human societies have decided to treat as binding. The customs and expectations that vary from city to city and era to era, and are therefore, by definition, not natural in the same fundamental sense. The lamp was always looking for the line between them. Where does the actual requirement end and the performance begin? Where does the genuine need stop and the convention start? Many conventions serve genuine functions and survive examination, but many do not. Many exist primarily to maintain hierarchy, to enforce the performance of status, to keep people attached to things that do not actually improve their lives, but that the social world has decided to treat as markers of worth. Those were the conventions Diogenes targeted, specifically and deliberately, in the most public possible place. With the lamp burning in the full light of an Athenian morning, he walked through the crowd. The flame was almost invisible in the daylight. The argument was perfectly clear. He carried the lamp through the agora, and nobody stopped him, and nobody could quite explain why the lamp bothered them, and nobody could quite bring themselves to tell him he was entirely wrong. Because, in the place where the city conducted its business, in the full light of a Mediterranean morning, in the middle of the most sophisticated civilization the ancient world had yet produced, the lamp was necessary, and everyone who saw it felt the question it was asking settle somewhere in the chest, in the place where unexamined assumptions live before someone finds the right way to illuminate them. What are you performing? And what are you actually being? He did not answer for them. That was never the point. The point was the question itself, alive in the marketplace air, in the space between the lamp and the people who saw it and looked away and went on with their morning, but carried the question with them without quite knowing they were carrying it. He kept walking. The lamp kept burning. The lamp was still lit. The question was in the air. And the most powerful man in the known world at that moment was about to ride into Corinth to ask a question of his own. Chapter 7. Alexander comes to visit. There is a particular quality to the silence that falls in a crowd when something unexpected happens. Not the silence of nothing occurring. The silence of everyone present understanding, at the same moment, that what they are watching is not ordinary, that they will be asked about it later, that the shape of it will stay with them longer than they have yet realized. That silence fell in Corinth on a morning whose precise date the ancient sources do not fully agree on. Plutarch, writing 400 years after the event, and Diogenes Laertius, writing 600 years after it. Both preserve accounts of what happened. Both place it during Alexander's time in Corinth in the mid-330s BC. Though the exact year and season remain uncertain in the historical record, we tell it here as the tradition has preserved it, with that uncertainty acknowledged from the start. A young man had arrived in the city. He was 20 years old, or close to it. He had inherited the kingdom of Macedon from his father Philip, who had been assassinated at a wedding celebration in circumstances that ancient historians have debated ever since. History records that in the months since his father's death, he had moved against Thebes with a speed and finality that ended with the city destroyed and most of its population sold into slavery. He had secured the compliance of the Greek city-states. He had been named hegemon of the League of Corinth, the military alliance that would carry his campaign east against the Persian Empire. He was, at that moment, the most powerful ruler in the known world, and while the delegations from every Greek city made their way to him, while the politicians and the generals and the influential figures of the Greek world presented themselves in the manner of people who understand that the powerful man in the room is the one they need to impress, one man stayed where he was. Diogenes was in a suburb of Corinth called Cranion, lying in a patch of morning sunlight, in the manner of a man who has arranged his day around the available warmth, and has no intention of rearranging it, because someone important has arrived in the vicinity. Alexander rode to him. He brought his companions, the inner circle of the most successful military operation the Greek world had assembled. They arrived at the place where Diogenes was lying, and gathered around in the way that attendants gather when they understand that their presence is part of the event. Alexander stood over Diogenes. His shadow fell across the man on the ground, blocking the sun that Diogenes had positioned himself to receive. The most powerful ruler in the known world at that moment looked down at the man who owned a cloak and nothing else, and asked what gift he could offer. What did Diogenes want? The question hung in the air. The companions waited. The silence had exactly the quality we described at the beginning of this chapter. Diogenes looked up. "Stand a little out of my light." That was the answer. Not go away. Not a speech about the worthlessness of worldly power. Not a lecture. One practical request. One sentence. "You are standing between me and the sun. Move a little." The practical request was also a philosophical statement, and everyone present understood it as both simultaneously. The most powerful ruler in the known world at that moment, with everything he could offer, was in that moment simply an obstacle between Diogenes and what he actually wanted. What Diogenes actually wanted was not complicated. It was the sunlight that had been there before Alexander arrived and would be there after Alexander left. Something that Alexander could not give him because it was already available, and something that Alexander was, at that moment, taking away. Alexander moved. He stood for a moment looking at the man in the sun. His companions were quiet in the particular way that companions are quiet when they are not sure what expression to wear. Then Alexander said the thing that every account of this encounter records. "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." Now, we should be honest about this moment in the way that honesty about this tradition always requires. Plutarch is writing 400 years after the event. Diogenes Laertius is writing 600 years after it. The story has the shape of a story that has been told many times by people who understood its symbolic weight and allowed that weight to influence the telling. Whether Alexander and Diogenes met in precisely this way, whether these are the exact words that passed between them, we cannot verify with the certainty that the story has sometimes been presented with. What we can say is that the ancient world believed this encounter happened, preserved it consistently across multiple independent sources, and returned to it for centuries, because it contained something true about the relationship between power and philosophy that other kinds of documentation could not capture as cleanly. A young man who was about to attempt the conquest of the known world recognized, in the man who wanted nothing from him, something he did not have and could not acquire through conquest. Why? This is the question underneath the famous exchange, and it is worth pressing on. Alexander had everything that Macedonian and Athenian civilization told a person they should want: power, military genius, the loyalty of extraordinary men, the resources of a kingdom, and the momentum of a campaign that would push the boundaries of the known world further than anyone had pushed them before. He was, by every conventional measure, the most successful human being alive, and something in the sight of Diogenes lying in the sun, needing nothing from him, wanting nothing from him, diminished in no way by his inability to provide anything useful, produced in Alexander a recognition that the conventional measures had missed something, freedom of a particular kind, the freedom that comes not from power over others, but from the complete absence of dependency on anything others can provide or withhold, the freedom that Diogenes had been practicing in the jar in Athens and in the sunlight in Corinth, the freedom that the Cynic philosophy was designed to produce, and that the young king, for one unguarded moment, apparently recognized he did not fully possess. If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes. The man in the sun said nothing in response. He did not need to. Alexander rode back to his army. He crossed into Asia the following year. He fought his way across Persia and Egypt and into the edges of what is now Pakistan. He died in Babylon at 32, of causes that historians still debate, in a palace that contained everything the world could offer a conqueror. Diogenes lived into his late 80s or early 90s. If the later tradition is to be believed, he died in Corinth, in the city where the sunlight had been good and the questions had been worth asking. He left no palace, no empire, no monument of the kind that empires build. He left the sunlight where it had always been, and the man who had wished, for one unguarded moment, to be him, had ridden away without it. The shadow had passed, the light had returned, and somewhere on the road back to the army, a young king was carrying a question he had not arrived with. Chapter 8. Captured by pirates. Sold into slavery. The Mediterranean in the 4th century BC was not a safe body of water, not for a man travelling without the protection of wealth or military escort, not for anyone moving between cities by sea without the kind of visible resources that made taking them more trouble than they were worth. Piracy was not a rare catastrophe in that world. It was a recognized feature of maritime life, a professional occupation practiced by people who understood the economics of it as clearly as any merchant understood the economics of legitimate trade. Ships were cargo, goods were cargo, and people, in the economy of the ancient world, were cargo of a particular kind that walked to market under their own power and retained their value through the journey. At some point in the middle decades of his life, Diogenes was captured. The tradition, as preserved by Diogenes Laertius and referenced in other ancient sources, tells us he was taken by pirates and brought to the island of Aegina, or possibly Crete, depending on which version you follow, and put up for sale, we should say clearly, as we always do with this tradition, that Diogenes Laertius is writing centuries after these events. The piracy story has the quality of a narrative shaped by the philosophical point it illustrates. Whether every detail is precisely as described is something the surviving evidence cannot confirm. What the ancient world consistently believed is that something like this happened, that Diogenes spent a period of his life as a slave, and that what happened during that period was, philosophically speaking, the most rigorous test his ideas had yet faced. At the auction, or something functionally equivalent to it, the question was put to him that was apparently put to everyone being sold. What did he know how to do? His answer, preserved in the tradition with the brevity that characterizes the best of his recorded sayings, was this: governing men. He then pointed to a man in the crowd, a wealthy Corinthian named Xeniades. He told the auctioneer that this man should buy him, because this man needed a master. Xeniades bought him. Now pause on this exchange before we go further. A man being sold as property in the full public setting of a slave market, in the presence of buyers who are assessing him as a commodity, responds to the question of his useful skills by naming the highest possible human function, not cooking, not farming, not any of the practical skills that would have established his market value in the conventional sense. Governing men, and then he identifies his buyer. He is not performing helplessness. He is not performing contempt for the proceedings. He is doing, in the worst possible circumstances, the thing he has always done, looking at the situation clearly, identifying what is actually happening beneath the surface of what appears to be happening, and responding to the actual reality rather than the performed one. The actual reality is that Xeniades, wealthy and powerful, and the legal owner of another human being in a few moments, is not free in the way that Diogenes understands freedom. He is governed by his appetites and his social position and the conventions of the world he has organized his life around. He needs, in the Cynic sense, a master, someone to show him what he is actually doing and what it costs. Diogenes was offering his services, Xeniades, to his considerable credit, understood what he was buying. He brought Diogenes to Corinth. He gave him responsibility for his household. More significantly, he gave him the education of his children. And here the tradition gives us something that reads less like philosophical myth and more like a genuine account of what happened in a specific household over a period of years. Diogenes taught the children in the Cynic manner. He trained their bodies alongside their minds. He taught them to ride and to handle themselves physically, not because hardship was good in itself, but because a body that cannot tolerate difficulty is a body that can be controlled through the threat of difficulty. He taught them to eat simple food, to dress without excess, to identify clearly and early the difference between what was genuinely valuable and what the social world around them was pretending was valuable. He taught them, in other words, what he had always taught, in a house, as a slave. With the same method and the same conclusions he had reached lying in a jar in the agora of Athens. Xeniades told people that a good spirit had entered his house. This detail is the one that stays longest in the entire slavery episode, not the dramatic exchange at the auction, not the claim about governing men. A man who bought a philosopher as a slave found, over the course of the relationship, that the philosopher was improving his household in ways that money could not have purchased directly. Here is the philosophical point that the piracy story is constructed around. Whether or not every detail of its construction is historically precise, Diogenes in chains was not less free than Diogenes in his jar. The freedom he had argued for, the freedom of the soul that cannot be reached by external conditions, was either real or it was not. If it was real, then the slave market was simply another marketplace, the chains simply another inconvenience, the condition of legal servitude simply another convention of nomos, of human law and custom, that had no power over physis. The actual nature of the man inside the condition. He had argued this in Athens. He now had to live it in Corinth, in a house that was not his, under conditions he had not chosen, and the tradition says he did. Eventually he returned to something like philosophical independence in Corinth. The precise mechanism is not documented clearly in the surviving sources. Whether Xeniades freed him formally, Whether the relationship evolved over time into something that made the legal categories meaningless in practice, the ancient sources do not tell us with certainty. What they tell us is that he ended up back in Corinth, that Corinth, rather than Athens, became the city of his mature and final years, and that the city where he had been sold in a market was the same city that would eventually put up a marble dog in his honour. He had governed men, in the end, not from a position of power, from a position of complete legal powerlessness, and the governing had been so thorough that the man who owned him called it the arrival of a good spirit. That is a strange kind of mastery. It is the only kind the Cynics ever claimed to be worth having. He had been tested by the worst the world could offer a free man. He had come through it still asking the same questions. Corinth was waiting. The sunlight was still good. Chapter 9. What he actually taught. One afternoon in Corinth, sometime in the latter decades of his life, Diogenes was sitting outside his jar when a young man approached him with a question. Not an unusual event. People came to him regularly by this point. Some came to argue, some came to mock, some came with genuine questions about how to live, and sat down in the dust beside the jar and stayed for hours. This young man wanted to know what philosophy was for. Diogenes looked at him for a moment. Then he said something that the tradition does not record precisely, but that we can infer from everything else he said and did across 8 decades of a philosophical life. It is for this. For right now, for the question you just asked, and whether you are actually asking it or only performing the asking, the stories are not the philosophy. They point at the philosophy. They enact the philosophy. They are, in Diogenes' particular method, the delivery mechanism for a set of ideas that deserve to be examined directly, as ideas, not just as behaviour. Because Diogenes did not write, he left no dialogues, no treatises, no organised account of his own doctrine. What he left was a practice and a set of reported sayings and the tradition of anecdotes that later ancient sources collected and preserved. From that material, generations of philosophers and historians have had to reconstruct what he actually thought. The reconstruction is not complete, but it is coherent enough to examine. Let us start with the idea that the ancient sources consistently identify as his most radical contribution, the one that broke entirely with everything that Greek philosophy had assumed before him. He called himself a cosmopolites, a citizen of the world. In the 4th century BC, this was not a metaphor and not a sentiment. It was a philosophical claim of enormous consequence, and it was a claim that the entire Greek world was organized to resist. The polis, the city-state, was not just the political unit of Greek civilization, it was the moral unit. Aristotle, working in Athens at roughly the same time as Diogenes, would write that the human being was, by nature, a political animal, meaning an animal whose nature could only be fully expressed within the life of a polis. To be without a city, to be an exile, was in Greek understanding not just a political condition, but a diminishment of humanity itself. Diogenes had been exiled. He knew exactly what the Greek world thought of people without cities, and he rejected the framework completely, not because he had not thought about it carefully, because he had thought about it more carefully than most, and concluded that the identification of the human being with a specific city was exactly the kind of arbitrary convention that the physis and nomos distinction was designed to expose. The human being was not Athenian or Corinthian or Macedonian by nature. The human being was a rational animal, capable of virtue and reason, and these capacities were not the property of any particular city or culture or tradition. They were universal. They belonged to the species. And if they belonged to the species, then the moral community of the human being extended to the species, not to the people who spoke your language or worshipped your gods or lived within your walls, to everyone. This claim, stated simply and lived completely, was one of the most consequential philosophical moves in the ancient world. The Stoics would take it and develop it into one of the most influential political philosophies in Western history. The Stoic concept of the universal human community, of the moral equality of all rational beings, regardless of origin or status, carries in one important sense the inheritance of the man in the jar who described himself as a citizen of the world. He did not belong to Sinope. He had never, in ein fundamental sense, belonged to Sinope. He belonged to the world, and the world was wherever he was. Now let us move to the second major idea, the one that gives Cynicism its particular texture and distinguishes it from the other traditions that emerged from Socrates' legacy. The Cynics were not interested in virtue as a theoretical concept. They were not interested in defining virtue the way Socrates spent his life asking people to define courage and piety and justice. They were not interested in constructing a systematic account of the good that could be written down and debated and taught in schools. They were interested in virtue as a practice. The Greek word is ascesis, which gives us the English word asceticism, but which meant, in its original context, something closer to training or exercise. The Cynics believed that virtue was like physical fitness in this respect. You could not think your way to it. You could not argue your way to it. You could not acquire it by studying accounts of it, any more than you could become physically strong by reading about exercise. You had to do the work. Every morning that Diogenes woke in the jar was a morning in which he practiced the thing he believed. Every meal of simple food was a repetition of the conviction that appetite did not govern him. Every winter night in the single cloak was a session of the training that the philosophy required. This is why the jar mattered, not as a statement of poverty, not as a performance of simplicity, as a training ground, as the place where the philosophy was practiced rather than merely argued. The third idea concerns the relationship between nature and happiness. The Cynics believed that happiness, eudaimonia in Greek, was available to anyone who lived in accordance with their actual nature. Now, Aristotle used the same word, eudaimonia, as the goal of the ethical life, but he and Diogenes meant very different things by it. Aristotle believed that happiness required certain external goods, health, friendship, a degree of material sufficiency, and that it could only be fully achieved within the life of a flourishing polis. Diogenes believed that happiness required none of these external conditions, that it was available to anyone, anywhere, in any circumstances, who had stripped away the false needs and found the genuine ones underneath. This disagreement about what happiness required was not a small one. It was the fault line running through the centre of 4th century BC Greek ethics for Diogenes, what the human being actually is. Underneath the social construction and the accumulated convention is a rational animal with certain genuine needs, and the capacity to meet those needs with remarkable simplicity. if the weight of social expectation is removed. Food, water, shelter adequate to survive, the exercise of reason, genuine relationship with other people based on virtue rather than usefulness. These are the needs. Everything else is extra, and the extra, far from adding to happiness, tends to subtract from it by creating new dependencies and new vulnerabilities and new sources of the anxiety that comes from having things that can be taken away. The Stoics inherited this intuition and built it into their practice in a more systematic way. Zeno of Citium arrived in Athens sometime around 312 BC, or thereabouts, as the ancient sources are not entirely precise on the date. He encountered the Cynic tradition through Crates of Thebes, who had been the most significant student Diogenes produced. He also studied with other philosophical figures of the period. What he eventually built was something that took the Cynic foundation seriously while constructing on it in directions that made the philosophy livable for people who were not prepared to sleep in jars. Stoicism kept the insistence that virtue was the only genuine good. It kept the distinction between what was up to us and what was not. It kept the cosmopolitan claim. It kept the practice of deliberate training in the endurance of difficulty. But it built a system around these commitments. It made itself compatible with holding public office, with owning property, with the social roles that a senator or an emperor might occupy. This compatibility was what Diogenes would not allow. But it was also what carried the core ideas further into the world than the Cynic practice alone could have reached. Epictetus, the freed slave who taught in Nicopolis in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, returned to something closer to the original Cynic intensity in his insistence that philosophy was not a set of doctrines to be memorized, but a practice to be lived, tested daily against actual conditions. His Enchiridion is one of the most concentrated expressions of the idea that freedom is internal and available to anyone who understands where to look for it. Marcus Aurelius, writing to himself in the private notebook that became the Meditations while running an empire that stretched from Scotland to Mesopotamia, returned again and again to the same questions that Diogenes had been asking from a jar in the Agora 2.5 centuries earlier. What is up to me? What am I carrying that I do not need to carry? What would remain if I put it down? In one important sense, the man in the jar stands behind the emperor's meditations. The line of inheritance runs through Crates to Zeno to the Stoic tradition that shaped Roman intellectual life for 5 centuries. It is not a simple, direct line, the way that influence rarely is. Other currents fed into it. Other thinkers contributed to it. But the Cynic foundation is there, identifiable, in the core commitments that the Stoics kept even when they were building something considerably more elaborate around them. This is the connection that the popular reception of Diogenes tends to miss, because the popular reception is focused on the entertaining surface of the stories. The ideas went somewhere. They went to some of the most influential philosophy in the history of Western civilization. They went to doctrines that shaped how educated people understood freedom and virtue, and the relationship between external conditions and inner life for the better part of a millennium. And they began here, in the Agora of Athens, in a jar, with a man asking a question that would not stop travelling once it started. The philosophy had been articulated. The inheritance had been traced. The questions were still moving. They had further to go than anyone in Athens could have imagined. Chapter 10. The city that didn't know what to do with him. He was still there. That is the first thing to understand about Diogenes and the cities that contained him. Not that he was tolerated or accommodated or even fully understood, simply that he was still there, year after year, in the same jar, in the same marketplace, asking the same questions. And the city had not found a way to make him stop. This is more remarkable than it appears. Athens had found a way to make Socrates stop. Corinth, which became Diogenes' city in the later decades of his life, did not. The difference between those two outcomes is one of the more interesting puzzles in the history of ancient philosophy. The responses to Diogenes, as the ancient sources preserve them, were not simple or uniform. They were the complicated, sometimes contradictory responses of a large number of different people encountering the same extraordinary situation and making sense of it through the lens of their own lives and their own unexamined assumptions. Some people brought him food. This is recorded in multiple sources, and it is worth pausing on, because it is one of the most humanly revealing details in the entire tradition. Citizens of Athens and later Corinth, people with no particular philosophical commitment and no special relationship with Diogenes, brought food to the jar, not because they were required to, not because they feared what would happen if they did not, because something about the sight of a man living with complete conviction in accordance with his stated beliefs produced in ordinary people a response that was closer to recognition than to charity, a sense that this person had done something they had thought about doing and had not done, had gone somewhere they had considered going and had turned back from. They brought bread. They brought olives. They left them and walked away. Others threw things at him. Children in particular are mentioned in the ancient sources as throwing dirt or small stones at the jar, testing the limits of the tolerance that the city had apparently decided to extend to him. Diogenes responded to this mockery, when the tradition records him responding at all, with a combination of indifference and the occasional sharp remark that sent the children away more confused than when they arrived. The mockery and the reverence existed simultaneously, directed at the same person by different segments of the same population, sometimes by the same person on different days, depending on what they had lost or gained that morning. What the city did not do, and this is the most significant thing about how Athens and Corinth responded to Diogenes, what the city did not do was put him on trial. Socrates was tried and executed in 399 BC. The charges were impiety and corrupting the youth. Behind the legal language lay a simpler political reality. Socrates had spent decades making powerful people look foolish in public, and in the paranoid political atmosphere of post-war Athens, his associations and his methods had made him a convenient target. Diogenes was, by almost any measure, more provocative than Socrates had been. He was louder in his contempt for social convention, more visible in his rejection of the values the city organized itself around. He claimed to be a citizen of the world, which was effectively a denial of the authority of any specific city's laws over him, and yet no jury was convened. No official mechanism of the city was deployed against him. The question of why deserves more than a simple answer. Part of the answer is political. Diogenes did not attract the kind of devoted aristocratic following that could be used to construct a narrative connecting philosophy to political danger. His most significant follower, Crates of Thebes, was a man of philosophical rather than political ambition. Part of the answer is methodological. Diogenes addressed the city as a whole, from a jar in the marketplace, through actions and brief remarks, rather than sustained dialectical examination of specific individuals. It was easier to dismiss and harder to prosecute. But part of the answer, the part that the ancient sources hint at without quite stating directly, is that the city was not entirely sure he was wrong. Not about everything, not about the radical conclusions, but about the diagnosis, about the gap between what Athens claimed to be and what the lamp in the full morning light suggested it actually was, about the question of whether the things the city worked so hard to acquire were actually producing the lives that the working was supposed to enable. These doubts were not comfortable. They were not the kind of thing you expressed in the assembly, but they were present, underneath the mockery and the offerings of food, and the slight embarrassment of encountering the man in the jar when you were on your way to do something that you were not entirely sure, on reflection, was worth the effort it required. Diogenes gave those doubts a home in the city's public life. He made the unspoken visible without naming the specific people who felt it. And that function, the function of the figure who embodies the doubt that everyone has but no one says aloud, is a function that cities sometimes protect even when they cannot quite explain why. Corinth, in the end, honoured him. After his death, the tradition describes a monument erected in his memory, a pillar topped with a statue of a dog, not a philosopher in the conventional pose of contemplation. A dog, the animal he had chosen as his philosophical emblem, the creature whose indifference to convention and whose focus on actual need he had spent his life imitating. The city that had watched him live in a jar and eat in the marketplace and challenge the value of everything it organized itself around. That city put up a dog in his honor when he was gone, because in the end, even a city that does not know what to do with someone can recognize, when they are gone, that the city was larger and stranger and more interesting for having contained them. Athens had killed Socrates. Corinth put up a dog. The difference between those two responses is the difference between a city that feared its most uncomfortable philosopher and a city that, having lived with its most uncomfortable philosopher for long enough, had arrived at something that was not quite understanding, but was at least, in the most practical sense, tolerance. And tolerance, for a man who had been exiled from his own city and sold in a slave market, was not nothing. It was, in fact, almost exactly what he had asked for. Not approval, not agreement, not the validation of the city's endorsement, just the room to live as he lived. In the light, with the cloak, with the questions, with the dog on the column when it was over. Chapter 11. The Death of a Dog. All lives end. The interesting question, for a philosophical tradition that has always treated death as a diagnostic tool, is not simply when and how. It is what the ending said about the life it concluded. Socrates drank the hemlock and spent his last hours in philosophical conversation, demonstrating to the end the equanimity his philosophy required. The manner of his death was consistent with what he had argued about death. Perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about a philosopher. Diogenes died in a way that is, by any standard of historical documentation, entirely unclear. And this is itself a kind of information. The ancient sources give us not one account of his death, but several. Diogenes Laertius presents multiple competing versions without clearly endorsing any of them. This is either a failure of documentation or an acknowledgement that the tradition preserved several stories because it could not agree on which was true, or because it found all of them useful for different reasons. Let us go through them honestly. One account says he died by holding his breath, that he simply decided, at some point in his advanced old age, that the life had been sufficient and that the time had come to end it. That he used the method available to a man who had spent decades training his body to endure conditions that would have broken ordinary physical resolve. This version is the most philosophically satisfying if you are a cynic. It makes the death an act of will. It makes the ending of the life as chosen as the manner of the living. Whether it is literally true is a different question from why the tradition preserved it. A second account says he died from a dog bite, that he was bitten while attempting to share a meal with a dog, that the wound became infected, and that the infection killed him. The man who modelled himself on dogs, dying of a dog bite. Whether it is literally true is something we cannot say. That the ancient world found it worth preserving tells us something about how the tradition understood the relationship between Diogenes and his chosen emblem. A third account says he ate a raw octopus and died of the resulting illness. This version is the least philosophically resonant, and therefore possibly the most literally accurate, which is how historical evidence often works. The prosaic versions survive precisely because nobody bothered to improve them. A fourth version says he died in his sleep, quietly and without drama, in the manner of a man who had arranged his life to minimize unnecessary suffering and extended that arrangement to the manner of his departure from it. We cannot say which of these is true. What we can say is that all of them were preserved because the ancient world found them useful. Diogenes died without an institution to memorialize him, without devoted students who felt the obligation to create the written record that would carry the moment forward with precision. He died as he had lived. In the margins of the city's official record, in the space between the jar and the marble statue, what the ancient sources do agree on is the manner in which he wished his body to be treated after death. He did not want a formal burial. The Greek funerary tradition was an elaborate social institution. It involved the preparation of the body, the laying out for mourning, the funeral procession, the specific rites at the gravesite, and the ongoing maintenance of the grave by family members who had an obligation to the dead that extended across generations. Diogenes wanted none of this. He reportedly said that he wished his body to be thrown into a field, outside the city walls, available to whatever use the natural world wanted to make of it. The instruction, across the various versions of the tradition, is consistent in its rejection of the funerary convention. The body, once the life had left it, was simply a body. What had been him was gone. His friends asked one more question. What should be done to protect his body if animals came near? He told them to put a stick nearby, so that he could drive them away. They pointed out that if he were dead, he would not be able to use a stick. He told them that in that case it would not matter. Let us stay here for a moment, not with the wit of the answer, though the wit is real, with what the answer is actually doing at the moment it is being given. He is dying, or he knows he is close to dying. And in this conversation, in these last exchanges about what should become of his body, he is still doing the thing he has always done, still drawing the same line, still asking the same question. What is this anxiety actually for? Who does it serve? What would you lose if you simply put it down? The stick was not going to help. The anxiety about the stick was not going to help. The elaborate funerary rituals that the city would perform for other men of his age and his influence. If he had allowed himself to become a man of influence, those rituals were not going to help. None of it was going to help, because he was not going to be there. He was still teaching. In the last conversation anyone would have with him, still drawing the line between what mattered and what only appeared to matter, still finding, even here at the absolute end, the same distinction he had been drawing since he arrived in Athens as a young exile from a Black Sea trading city with nothing to his name and nowhere particular to go. The jar is empty now. The cloak is folded somewhere in the long past. The man who chose those things, who tested that choice against slavery and mockery and winter nights and the offers of the most powerful man in the world, that man is gone, and the questions he asked are still in the room, still here, in the air of whatever room you are in, at whatever hour this is, in the quiet before sleep. That is not sentiment. That is simply what happens when a question is good enough. It outlasts the person who asked it. It finds new rooms, new hours, new people willing to let it settle and do what questions do when you give them enough stillness to work in. Corinth honoured him. The tradition describes a monument, a pillar topped with a dog in stone, erected in the city where he had lived and been sold as a slave and returned, and continued to ask his questions until there were no more left to ask. Epitaphs were composed in his honour. One, preserved in the Greek anthology, though its precise date and authorship remain uncertain, captures an idea that deserves to sit with you before we continue. The easiest path through life. That is what this epitaph attributes to him. Not the hardest, the easiest. It sounds wrong. It sounds like the phrase furthest from accurate for a man who slept in a jar and wore one cloak in winter and was sold in a slave market and died with no possessions and asked to be left in a field. But the ancient author reached for exactly that phrase, and the reaching was not ironic. Every path that was not Diogenes' path required the maintenance of something. Property required management. Reputation required management. Social relationships of the conventional kind required constant negotiation and performance. Political ambition required the sustained subordination of genuine preference to strategic calculation. The conventional life was not easy. It was enormously demanding, in ways that were mostly invisible, because everyone around you was equally engaged in the same demands, and therefore could not see them as the extraordinary expenditure of energy they actually were. Diogenes had put down most of what the conventional life required you to carry, and what remained, once you put it down, was not the hardship that everyone assumed. It was something closer to ease. The ease of not managing what does not need managing. The ease of not wanting what does not need wanting. The ease of a life reduced to its actual requirements, and therefore light enough to carry without exhausting the person who carried it. The easiest path through life, said by someone whose life looked from the outside like the hardest path imaginable. The jar is empty now. The light is moving across the field where they left him. The marble dog stood in Corinth until the marble was lost to the centuries, as marble tends to be when the civilization that erected it moves on and the people who knew what it was for are gone. But the question made it further than the marble. It always does. When the question is good enough. Chapter 12. The long shadow of the dog. There is a particular kind of influence that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with citations and formal acknowledgement. It seeps into the foundations of the traditions that came after it, shapes the questions those traditions thought to ask, determines which problems seemed worth solving and which solutions seemed worth keeping. And then it disappears into the structure of the thinking, the way a foundation disappears into the building it supports. You do not see the foundation when you look at the building, but remove it and the building falls. In one important sense, Diogenes of Sinope is one of the most consequential missing foundations in the history of Western philosophy. The most direct line of inheritance runs through Crates of Thebes. Crates was the most significant student that Diogenes produced. He was a man of some wealth who, on encountering the Cynic tradition, gave it away and adopted the Cynic life. He married a woman named Hipparchia, who encountered the tradition through Crates and chose it with the same deliberateness that he had. She adopted the Cynic cloak. She accompanied Crates into public philosophical life. She engaged in philosophical discussion in the spaces where women of her era were not expected to appear. She chose this life against the explicit opposition of her family. Hipparchia matters not only as a biographical detail, but as a demonstration that the Cynic practice was not exclusively male, that its principles extended naturally to anyone who encountered them with sufficient seriousness, and that the tradition was, in its core commitments, more egalitarian than most of the alternatives available in 4th century BC Greece. From Crates, the inheritance runs to Zeno of Citium. Zeno arrived in Athens, studied with Crates, studied with other teachers of the period, and eventually built something that took the Cynic foundation seriously while making it livable for people who were not prepared to sleep in jars. Stoicism kept the insistence that virtue was the only genuine good. It kept the cosmopolitan claim that the moral community extended to all rational beings. It kept the practice of deliberate training in the endurance of difficulty. What it added was system and compatibility. Through the Stoic tradition, what had lived in a jar in Athens arrived in the letters of Seneca, then in the handbook of Epictetus, then in the private notebook of Marcus Aurelius, the emperor of Rome, writing to himself in Greek in the 2nd century AD, returning again and again to the question of what was genuinely in his control and what only appeared to be, was in one important sense asking the questions of a man who had lived 2.5 centuries before him in a ceramic storage vessel in the Agora of Athens. Marcus Aurelius did not cite Diogenes directly. He cited the Stoic tradition, but the Cynic foundation is there, identifiable in the core commitments that Stoicism kept, even as it built something more elaborate around them. The influence does not end with the ancient world. Centuries passed. The medieval period encountered Diogenes primarily through compilations and encyclopedias rather than through primary texts. He appeared as a figure whose stories illustrated points that the tradition needed illustrated, points about the vanity of wealth and the superiority of the inner life to external conditions. The Christian tradition could find in his practice a pagan anticipation of monastic virtues, while maintaining the theological distance that his paganism required. More centuries passed. The Renaissance brought a fuller recovery of the ancient sources. The translation of Diogenes Laertius into Latin in the 15th century made the tradition available in more complete form. Humanist scholars found in Diogenes a figure who resonated with their project of recovering the ancient world as a resource for living in the present. More centuries still. Friedrich Nietzsche, in the 19th century, wrote about Diogenes with a warmth he rarely extended to anyone. He admired the consistency, the refusal to separate the philosophy from the practice, the willingness to make the life itself the argument. Whether Nietzsche's famous image of the madman with a lantern in the marketplace, searching in broad daylight for something the marketplace cannot provide, consciously echoes the ancient lamp story, is something scholars continue to debate. The resonance between the two images is striking enough to be worth noting, while remaining honest that noting it is not the same as proving a direct connection. And now, the contemporary moment has its own version of the encounter with Diogenes, though it rarely recognizes it as such. The various cultural currents that question whether the accumulation of goods and options and experiences is actually producing lives of the quality the accumulation is supposed to produce are asking, in the vocabulary of contemporary life, a question whose oldest surviving formulation belongs to a man who threw away a wooden cup in Athens in the 4th century BC after watching a child drink from cupped hands. These connections are offered as intellectual resonances, echoes across time of a question that keeps finding new contexts rather than a documented chain of direct influence. The honest statement is this: the question Diogenes was asking, what do you actually need, and what are you carrying that you think you need but have not checked, is a question that human beings in every era rediscover, sometimes with awareness of who asked it before them, sometimes without. He would not have been interested in the credit. He would have been interested in the question. The shadow of the dog stretched longer than anyone in Athens could have measured, and the question it cast was still moving, still finding new walls to fall against, still waiting for whoever picked up the lamp next. Chapter 13. What the Man in the Jar Knew. We have come to the end of a long journey, and it is the nature of long journeys that they leave you somewhere different from where you started, though the difference is not always easy to name immediately, especially in the quiet hours, in the dark before sleep, when the thinking that the day has been too loud to allow finally has the room to settle. You started with an image, a large clay jar on a street corner in Athens, a man inside it, by choice, the most powerful man in the world standing over him, casting a shadow across the morning sunlight, asking what gift he could offer, and the answer that sent the most powerful man in the world stepping sideways out of the light. We followed that man from Sinope to Athens, from the counterfeiting scandal that exiled him to the gymnasium, where he refused to be turned away by a raised staff, from the jar in the agora to the slave market in Aegina, from the sunlight in Corinth to the marble dog that stood in his memory until the marble was lost and the memory was not. We followed his ideas from the 4th century BC to the Stoics who built on them, to the scholars who preserved fragments of them, to the world that keeps rediscovering them without always knowing their address. Now, I want to do something different from summarizing. Summarizing is not what this moment calls for. I want to leave you with the question that Diogenes spent his life asking, that he asked through every action the tradition records, that he asked with the lamp and the plucked chicken and the single cloak and the refusal to move when Alexander came to him and the instruction to leave his body in a field. The question is not about simplicity as an aesthetic. It is not about minimalism as a lifestyle. It is not about poverty as a virtue or comfort as a vice. Those are the frames we tend to put around it, and they are all too small. The question is about the relationship between what you want and who you are, between what you have been taught to want and what you would want if you stopped, carefully and honestly, and asked yourself where the wanting was coming from and whether the getting would actually produce what the wanting was pointing at. Diogenes lived in Athens, one of the most sophisticated civilizations the ancient world produced, a civilization of remarkable intellectual achievement, of philosophy and democracy and art, and the first sustained attempt in human history to think clearly and publicly about how human beings should live. And he walked through its marketplace in the middle of the day with a lit lamp, looking for an honest man. Not because the Athenians were unusually dishonest, because the gap between what a civilization says it values and what it actually organizes its daily life around is a gap that exists in every civilization. And the sophistication sometimes makes the gap harder to see rather than easier, because sophisticated civilizations are very good at constructing explanations for why what they are doing is consistent with what they say they value, even when it is not. The lamp was for the gap. You can hold your own lamp up if you are willing to look at what it illuminates. This is not comfortable. Diogenes was not offering comfort. He was offering something that is, in the long run, more valuable than comfort: clarity. The clarity that comes from having actually examined the assumptions you are living by rather than having inherited them and proceeded on the assumption that inherited assumptions must be adequate because everyone around you is operating on the same ones. The Athenians had inherited their assumptions. They had assumed that wealth was good, that reputation was good, that the conventional markers of a successful Athenian life were actually the markers of a good life. They were too busy living by them to examine them. Diogenes had examined the assumptions. He had taken them apart, one by one, held each piece up to the light. The lamp was always burning, asked what it was actually for, and kept the pieces that had an actual answer and discarded the pieces that did not. What was left, at the end of that examination, was small enough to fit in a jar, and the man who fit his life into a jar was, by every account the tradition preserves, a man who was not unhappy, who was not diminished, who was not spending his days in the quiet suffering of someone who has made a sacrifice they regret. He was a man who had found, by going in the direction that most people do not go, something that felt like the thing they had been looking for in the direction they were going and not finding there. I am not telling you to sell your possessions and sleep in a jar. That is not what this story is for. The jar was Diogenes' answer to his own examination, in his own circumstances. In the 4th century BC, your examination, in your circumstances, in the present, will not produce the same answer. It should not. The Cynic point was never that the jar was the answer. The Cynic point was that the examination was the requirement. Look at what you are carrying. Ask what it is for. Keep the things that have an honest answer. Question the things that do not. That is all. That is the whole philosophy. It takes about 30 seconds to state and a lifetime to practice, which is why Diogenes is still worth sitting with 2,400 years after he sat in his jar in the agora of Athens. Diogenes left no books. He left no institution. He left no organized school that would carry his name forward through the centuries in the way that Plato's academy carried Plato's name. He left a practice and a set of stories and a question, and the question is still here. It made it further than the academy. It made it further than the empires that rose and fell around it, and the civilizations that succeeded each other across the centuries while the question kept travelling. What do you need? What are you carrying that you could put down? What would remain if you put it down? The questions are good questions. They are worth the sitting. Diogenes would tell you that the fact that you are still here, still willing to stay with the discomfort of the examination, rather than rolling over and choosing the inherited thing, the unexamined thing, means something. It means the lamp is still lit, and that is, in the end, what the man in the jar knew, not the answers. The questions are not the kind that have answers in the ordinary sense. What he knew was which questions mattered and which questions were just noise, and how to tell the difference. He knew that the difference between noise and signal, in a civilization saturated with both, requires exactly the kind of sustained, uncomfortable, honest attention that most people spend their entire lives finding reasons to postpone. The lamp was not contempt. It was an offer. Here is what I see when I look carefully. You are welcome to look with me. Tonight you did. The jar is empty now. The cloak is folded somewhere in the long past. The marble dog is gone from its column in Corinth, lost to the same centuries that take everything physical eventually. But the light in the lamp is still the same light. It does not go out. It only waits for someone willing to carry it. Good night, and thank you for staying until the end.